Over to you, Sonia. Sonia Swarup Choksi is our next speaker. Sonia, can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, Ishita, I can hear you.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes, all audible and clear. So
Okay,
over to
great.
you.
So I'm planning to switch off the video if there is disturbance, and I'll just do that. And let me know if there's a disturbance. I'll just switch off the video.
Yes, we'll let you know.
Okay, great. Hi, everybody. I'm actually feeling quite small in front of all that I've been hearing about you guys doing, the kind of data that you put together, and the years of work that's been there. Uh, my work is more into entertainment and education, and well, yes, to me it's quite serious enough. So I like to share that as well. I'm a documentary filmmaker and an entrepreneur. I come from a small town called Lucknow, and the thing that happens with people who live in Lucknow is a lot of culture infusion, also with a lot of tradition and a lot of restrictions. But I've been blessed to be born in a family which has been extremely forward looking. So no, in my growing up, I experienced a huge amount of a concoction of a very progressive family, which really thought about people beyond the immediate five people in our family, thought about the society, into literature, art, and culture, but very controlled and dominated by how the city moved. So the city had its rules about the girls. The city had its own restrictions. Ye hona chahiye, wo nahi hona chahiye. So I have grown up looking at my parents being sandwiched between what they actually thought and what they wanted to bring out versus what they actually, set up as the rules of the house. Way back in my childhood, I experienced what is fear, and what fear and the fear of survival can do to people in different shades. And as luck would have it, while I was looking at different career opportunities, I did end up following my passion for documentary making. And I mean, it can't be very surprising, but the documentary world totally took me on because it was about real people, it was about real challenges, it was about real stories, and there was a huge potential to actually take the story forward to create an impact if one would want to do that. So I have done I have worked largely with the BBC, worked on HIV/AIDS awareness back in 2003, 2004. Worked on a lot of projects, but I would want to mention a project that I really that altered a lot of thought process into me, was working on acid attack survivors. So it just happened. I came across certain facts and figures about the acid attacks increasing, and I started researching on that, and ended up started making a film on Lakshmi Agarwal, who's quite famous now because of the film with Deepika Padukone. But that is the time that she got burned, and with her there were about 8 to 10 other girls that, it used to be just something that we would get a call anytime in the day and say, this one got burnt in this village, this one got burnt in this village. And there was no structure, there was just no structure. The police would not take the complaint, the government would not, there was just nothing that they wanted to do except judging the people who got burnt. So my work moved, it started with the documentation. Like, it was not about making a film, but it was just about documenting what's going on, because I couldn't do anything else. So I just wanted to document what was going on and capture as much as possible. And that led on to, over a period of time, all that I captured led on to taking it to the North Block, South Block, in the Indian government spaces, like police stations, women welfare things. Eventually, after 4 years of work into acid attack process, we did end up getting policies made, and some refinement made. At least we got to a level that the police started taking the FIR of somebody who got burnt. Before that, it was not even a category on their list of something that wrong that has happened to you. So we got that changed. We got some of the policies made about banning of acid in the country. So I actually wanted to show a film on that, but maybe the internet would not allow. So I'll keep it maybe for the later. But my documentary career also, obviously it means a lot of travel, it means a lot of research, and it took me to a very subtle world of performing artist. So I used to work in television. I had the privilege to be working with BBC for a really long time. So the money and the timelines were all fine. It was not like a struggling aspect as a lot of other times in the documentary space we have. But my experience in that project was, while we were working with the brand and we had it all, but the kind of content that we wanted to create and the kind of people that we wanted to work with were very difficult to access, extremely difficult to access. Why was that? Because the channel of accessing the people was very broken. So it is all about who knows who. So I might know 50 people, you might know 500 people, which may not, the 50 and the 500 may not be relevant to something that you're doing at that moment. And what you end up working with is like sort of compromise, sort of make shift happen. And it was not just this experience, but many repeated experiences where we really wanted to work with a certain type of an artist. There was a particular dialogue, a narrative in our mind, and we had a character sketch of a person like this, an artist like this would be able to deliver on that. But where is this person? How do we find this person? And we obviously, like in television and film and cinema and everywhere, it was one person to another and led it to, and we completed the projects. But somewhere down the line, I and a friend of mine, a very close friend of mine, we were thinking about impact. I mean, it sounds cliche, that thinking about impact, but yes, I do. So for me, everything that I'm looking at, observing, my thought is, okay, what can I do that can impact to shift this thing at least a little better? And so when we were talking about that, what is it that we can impact, me and my friend were thinking about that. The word of change, the changing the word of a performing artist sprung up to me loud and clear. Like, I mean, the context that I gave, like I've been in HIV, AIDS awareness, acid attacks, but it didn't show up for me. What showed up for me was the performing arts space, and I had this vision that there is this whole community of performing arts across the country. We are so rich in art and culture through generations and generations. They are the people who entertain us. They are the people who always, from the births, from the lullaby to the final farewell when a person dies, to everything in between, and to even a mundane day, to hearing the kind of music, to hearing the kind of film, the play, the short film, that 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 builds us, that builds the person in us, are these performing artists. They're spread all across the country, but we have no structures for them. We have no structures for them, and we have no structures for the, let's say, the industry, or people who work with them, to really access them. So itna kuch hai, but we're all just doing like makeshift arrangement. So we got onto, and after a lot of work and thinking, I chose the path of technology. I said, traditionally, going forward, we will not be able to shift much in our lifetime. There are already a lot of people doing a lot of stuff in their own small little ways. But the only way that we can actually shift this something is if we get to a certain scale. Because the performing artist is not the situation is not limited to Delhi or a Bombay or a Hyderabad. It's the world. And unless that shifts, unless the way the performing arts space is respected, understood, structured worldwide, it's going to be something just I could have pursued as a hobby. So we went on to start building the technology. In a nutshell, the technology that I wanted to build was a search engine, because my understanding was that, how do you find a person that's an abstract in your head? So how do you find an 18 to 20-year-old bald male actor from Nasik? So I mean, if this is a character sketch in your mind, or if you're looking for the folk artist, the Rajasthani folk artist living in Navi Mumbai, So I mean, these are the kind of ways that we all look at our briefs. We look at the first step and the second step of an ideation of a person who could fit into that role, but we don't have a name for this person. It is not a popular name that we could just reach out to. So we started building the search engine. And the search engine today is built exactly like this, that you, whatever you're thinking in your head about an abstract person, you type in there, and if we have any person closer to that description into our backend, the profile would show up and you could directly contact that person. So we don't, obviously the idea was never to work in like an agency, and we don't do that. But so we map the country. We go to tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, absolute deep ends, to the metros and the high ends. We reach out everywhere with a very small team and effort. And for the last 4 years, we've been only trying to get to these performing artists, get them onto our platform. So to build a way, a digitized mechanism, and a profile that can be assessed and understood by somebody who's looking at working with them. They don't have these skills. They perform day in and out, but they don't even carry like a reel of themselves. So working on the documentation, on the media, on the profiling, on the kind of detailing that they should be giving it out, to the way they would want to be seen. We work on all of them. So that initiative is called matchmytalent.com. Now that's been going all great and fine until, of course, the lockdown was declared. And so it was a challenge, but it was also an opportunity. The biggest thing that happened and that shocked me was that all these people that we've been trying to shift the life for the last 4 years suddenly were totally at a halt. Totally, like it's a lockdown today. So every event, every gig, every shoot, every concert, every better that's happening anywhere in the country is cancelled, just cancelled. And not just one or two or three or four, but it's cancelled for months together. And okay, fine, they have a different radar of their savings and stuff, but these are practically the daily wage workers. If they earn that day, that is what they have. So not having an opportunity to earn for like months altogether depression is the least that I could say. But we got into a conversation so we have a community of about 45,000 performing artists with us now. And we got into talking to them in small groups. And I did realize that the artist in them was completely clearly theirs. They wanted to do an agile development, and they said, it's okay, we will pass through this time. And on the contrary, I was also realizing how much of entertainment people under the lockdown was consuming. It is actually the music, the film, the poetry that was keeping people's sanity in. So we connected the two, and we created the Maitri project, which is a live streaming project wherein we bring an artist to a live stream, to an Instagram or to a Facebook of ours, and get them to perform. We send out invitations to our 45,000 people, and whatever else we can do. We get the community, and so we get their audience and they get to perform. So an artist who was getting at that point of time blocked to, okay, what am I going to do? Yes, they're not getting paid still, but they're getting to perform, and they are accessing a very large network, which is like a 45,000 people network about them. And already, so the idea was to start their revenue generation in some way. So after a couple of sessions of Maitri project with some great artists performing, independent artists, we got into the corporates, we got everybody who was doing webinars and stuff, and we said, let's bring in some art, let's bring in some music into that. And we got artists to start performing in the webinars. And that sort of altered a little format. A revenue generating format happened for them. And for the corporates and the webinar attendees, we brought in some art and music into them. So that's what we do. But yes, post COVID, the struggle for me is to really keep taking the Maitri project to a sustainable format, because the country is too big. There are too many people who are performing artists, and obviously their revenue generating channels have reduced. Anyways, we were so tight on that, and now it's further reduced. So it's like we have to completely reinvent something for them. They are doing whatever they could do, but we also have to do that. So we are doing that. The aspect of work, like I said initially, was education. So that started with the birth of my daughter, and like when I experienced the children. Children wanted to speak, children wanted to read, all at the same time. They're bustling with energy, and but what happens is that we don't have enough material to engage them, and in today's time we don't even have so much time as one would rightly need for the child. And I was observing how much the world was getting restricted to the mobiles and the screens, as a way to engage with the child effectively, and it didn't work for me. It just didn't work for me. Like I can't explain why it didn't work for me, but for me it just doesn't work that you put the child in front of a television or a mobile and let them watch whatever it is. Probably also because I've been on the content development side, and I have a sense of what is the premise of that content which is getting generated. It is not the benefit of the child, but it is TRP, it's advertising, it's everything else. So that didn't work for me. So I actually and I'm a book lover, I'm a book reader. So but I realized that, I mean, there were not many books that I could put together for my own daughter at that age, because she couldn't read much. So every book had to be limited to something that I could read for her. So the experimenting led to an innovation where I created another company called Go Discover, and there we started making books which are paper books, but we have a device like a talking pen. If you touch that pen onto the paper, whatever is recorded, on whatever is printed and programmed onto the paper, can be heard. So suddenly the child whose world was not going beyond the picture of the apple or the picture of the elephant, can now be literally anything. Like however much we want to talk about the elephant, in whichever language we want to talk about the elephant, is possible, because the child of course can hear, right? I mean, that's a strength that they've been born with. So I started focusing on building the listening and the speaking capability, instead of trying to push them to start reading and writing, because they do not need to. They're the child of a human. They will eventually learn it all. So that.
Sonia, sorry to interrupt. We have 2 minutes more.
Sure, just wrap it up. Sure. So, like in the pre-COVID time, we had been progressing to reach out to schools, to retail. We've been in the business for 5 years now, and the smart books and the smart charts go out in the market. But there has been a challenge of screen. We constantly kept on facing this whole challenge of, but the child wants an app and the screen and everything. But in the COVID time, the good thing that has happened is that every child has had so much of the screen that probably the schools and the parents have started seeing the logic of why the and what the screens are doing. So we've been able to penetrate the kids far better into the municipality school circuits, into the slums, into everywhere. And the only challenge that we're facing with the COVID time now is the movement. Like there is so much of a possibility of creation of this content and deployment, but because we are restricted by our own physical movement, that is not being able to reach. That's a little about our work. I would be happy to share some links of the films and stuff, but I just thought it's easier to just tell about it now, and I can share the films later. Thank you for listening to so much.
Thank you, Sonia. That was very exciting, and the passion with which you speak about it shows why it's so important. And I think the more I've been thinking about your work post our conversation is the fact that, yes, there is a sort of sidelining of different kinds of professions as well. So as much as arts and performing arts does have a side of glamour to it, it's still not something that gets funded the most, or something that's worrying right now anybody. How will they, or rather we, survive, right? So people are worried about how will the shop owners survive, but what about the art and design practitioners or performers? And I'm glad that you still also spoke about children at the end, because I at least personally have been very curious as to how are the kids taking it and why are they not complaining. Because if I was to imagine myself at their age, I would have been cribbing and complaining by now that why can't I go out? But these kids seem to be all okay. And I know my sample size is not huge to generalize this, but it is still worrying that the screens have become a part of their life, and the physical world outside is seemingly not the first temptation for them. And again, I hope that these ideas will be something that the teams could develop, and they could use your resources perhaps make the online platform more sustainable over the next 2 days and see if that's one of the ways to collaborate and unlock our networks. So with that, thank you, Sonia. I'm going to move on to our last speaker for the morning, that is Swarnima Bhattacharya. Swarnima, can you unmute yourself?
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Ishita, for having me. And it was so amazing listening to all the speakers. And, so many synergies sort of automatically come to mind while listening to everyone. So thank you for that.
I'm actually glad that we could actually have such an interesting mix of presenters and mentors. So yes, over to you.
All right, so I don't have, very deliberately, I don't have a presentation prepared because I just wanted this to be more of a conversation. And because we're thinking in terms of design dialogue, I'm throwing some ideas and some insights at you. And I would love to hear from you further about what you make of this. Just one small thing, if somewhere, there is a problem with the audio, please let me know on the chat or something, and I'll switch off my video and continue there. All right.
Sure.
So my name is Swarnima Bhattacharya. I'm also actually from Lucknow. I now live in Delhi, and I run a women's health organization, which is a virtual consulting and coaching health platform for women. And we're a hyper-local discovery platform for services such as lactation consultants, pelvic health consultants, and so on. Now, I just want to take you through through the ecosystem of women's health and just share some facts with you. A lot of it might get very depressing, but that's okay. I think we just have to contend with it, I guess. So, whether we all have realized this or not, the fact is that women's health has been medically under-researched and culturally blindsided. And when we talk of women's health, a lot of people, just essentialize it to fertility health or the reproductive responsibility of women. Well, it's, PCOS, endometriosis, all of that. Or people talk about the hygiene factors, about how a lot of women in under-resourced communities in India do not have access to sanitation supplies while they are menstruating. Now, I would like to reframe this problem and call it more as a lack or an absence of a culture of care around women, which leads to women's health issues rather than it being really issues in themselves. For instance, when we look at women's health, such as PCOS, endometriosis, fibromyalgia, which disproportionately affects more women than men, we are talking about specific disorders and ailments. But because of the way women's health and women's positions is framed in our society, what happens is that so-called natural and normal life processes, such as menstruation, menopause, pregnancy, childbirth, these are also experiences that become riddled with pain, discomfort, and often disease. Why do you think that happens? Why is it that something that women have been experiencing since the beginning of time, like menstruation and childbirth and menopause, those are also things that we know precious little about? The kind of research we are doing today is not even beginning to scratch the surface. There are so many menstrual disorders that are happening today, and we don't know anything about it. But these are experiences that women have been facing and menstruators across the board have been facing since the beginning of time. So we are trying to reframe the women's health issue as a problem that is caused by an absence of a culture of care, rather than the fact that, there are gynecological disorders going around here and there. Let me throw some facts and data at you. It was only in 2016, that is 4 years ago only, that the National Institute of Health framed policy where gender would be considered as a biological factor for medical research. Only in 2016. In 1993, this was, basically in so many of our lifetimes, that federal law in US was enacted, making it mandatory for women to be included in medical research funded by the NIH, that is the National Institute for Health. 1993, like right now. Then there was a Leeds University research which showed that that women are 50% more likely to be misdiagnosed after a heart attack. A study by University of Pennsylvania showed that women waited 16 minutes longer than men to receive pain medication after visiting an emergency room. The International Pelvic Pain Society estimates that 61% of women suffering from chronic pelvic pain don't even know what is causing it. This is the overall situation of how women's health is either being researched or dealt with. Closer home, let me share some more troubling statistics. PCOS is something that, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome, is something that affects 1 in 10 women in India. And this incidence is much higher than across the world. Across the world, the average incidence of PCOS is 1 in 12 women, but in India it is ranging from 1 in 3 to 1 in 10, depending on where in India you are. 37% of the world's female suicides occur in India. Every 8 minutes, a woman in India dies of cervical cancer, and 1 in 22 urban women develop breast cancer in their lifetime in India. Very depressing statistics, very worrisome statistics. And I would like to tell you what is the kind of response I get when I talk about these things, when I say that women, that medicine has a bias towards women, that medical technology has a bias towards women. Most of the time, there is such a resistance, there is a resistance that no, like these statistics tell an incomplete story, and sometimes it is this, sometimes it is that. The one thing that I'm told very, well-intentionally, in a very well-intentioned manner, that women have been excluded from medical research for so long because of the hormonal changes that happen in our bodies on a monthly, cycle, and that is what complicates research. To this, the response is that actually men have a daily menstrual cycle. All of us are hormonal. It is not just women. Everything in our body, whether it is our growth, our hunger, our exhaustion, our sleep cycle, it's all about hormones. So basically, an author had said that hormonal is the equivalent of modern day hysterical. Earlier, we used to say that women are hysterical. Now we say, they are hormonal. Hormones have become an apologia. It has become an apologia for women's exclusion from every state of being, whether it is medical research, whether it is dignity, whether it is representation in the workforce. But the reality is that women's hormones and women's hormonal processes are much more predictable, much more trackable, and much more cyclical than anybody else. Yet women are the ones who face so much stigma. Now, my question to you is, and if you want, we can have an interactive session if the format allows. Otherwise, this is just a question you can sort of deal with, when you're doing your further research on these talks. My question to you is, what is the solution? My question to you is, how many of us, when we were growing up, how many of us really remember our period stories? And I'm talking about people who are, in a very privileged space. A lot of people, spoke about how we belong to very privileged families. I do not belong to a privileged family at all when I was growing up. What I have today, it's because of the education my parents were able to give me. And I have faced the regressive culture of Lucknow so deeply in my upbringing, where my mother underwent hysterectomy when I was in school, and it was considered the most normal thing that if you've had, if your family is complete, if you have 2 children, and you are well past your prime, and these are all, things that doctors have been saying, Then if you're having any menstrual disorder, if you're having any problems, then just go for a hysterectomy. Hysterectomy is the partial or complete removal of ovaries and the uterus, for those who are unaware. And that brought with it its own set of issues. That brought with it its own set of hormonal complications. And what concerns me the most is that whenever we talk about women's health, the impulse is always to manage, it's always to fix, rather than look at the systemic, socio-cultural, and biological issues which are causing this pain. We focus so less on women's nutrition. Nutrition is just one example. Now there is so much evidence on how PCOS, endometriosis, and so much else can be managed through diet and lifestyle changes. But some other speakers spoke about women's nutrition, and let me talk about a little bit, about the relationship between women and food. There is a lot of, the Janani Suraksha Yojana, and there is a Janani Poshan Yojana, and various such policies that are talking about women and their nutrition, and they're putting this as in the forefront of the agenda in policy. But I don't know whether this is the demographic where this, experience has happened. But in most cases, women and food, this is such a political relationship. Women and nutrition is such a political relationship. I'm not sure how many of you would have faced this, but it is such a commonplace experience, which I'm sure you'd agree, is that women in our families, mothers in our families, are always eating last. If there is a son in the family, then somehow the husband and the sons, they are being given the larger pieces of I don't know, like some food or some non-vegetarian, stuff. Women are often, yesterday I was reading a tweet by somebody that when the mother of this person was learning how to, make rotis, and if there was a roti that was getting burnt or it was not perfectly round, she would put it at the bottom of the casserole so that she would eat it and the rest of the family would eat the perfect, round, well-made roti. These are small sacrifices, and these are small ways in which women internalize that they are not deserving of nutrition. They are not deserving of the good food or food at all. There is this virtue and fondness and the pedestalization of sacrifice that is internalized by women, which makes them compromise on their health, their nutrition, or any kind of investment in themselves. And we think that when it comes to women's health and stuff like that, it is just the rural areas that need an intervention, but that's not entirely true. It's not true, because had that been the case, then we wouldn't have incidences of so many menstrual and hormonal disorders in the urban areas. We wouldn't have such an abnormally high levels of cesarean deliveries in the urban areas. We would not have such high incidences of postpartum depression and cancer in urban areas. The fact is that before we could even go to the root of the notion of women's well-being, we created a very welfarist attitude towards women's issues and gender framing, where we said, you know what, now that women are working, they are going out, they are getting an education, we have solved the problem in the urban areas, now let us focus just on the rural. And what's happening is that we are making this problem and this issue of women and health and women and well-being a very binary situation. Look at the urban areas around you. In a context like India, can we really make urban and rural something so black and white? Absolutely not. I am sitting in a house in South Delhi. If I go just a few kilometers northwards, the reality of women changes completely. A lot of us have spoken about, and a lot of us have read about the rising instances of domestic violence after, in the aftermath of the COVID lockdowns. Most of the cases that have come to us, they have come from urban areas. That suddenly, an abusive husband is not working, in office, and he is doing all kinds of stuff. Abusive in-laws, women who are living in urban areas, but really, really small tenements where there are 7 members or 5 members in the family and one bathroom, and they are not able to use the bathroom for more than a few minutes every day, and that is seriously affecting their health. When we oversimplify the contextualization, the spatial contextualization especially of women's health and gender issues, we are actually neglecting the granularity of women's experience. I am born and brought up in Lucknow, and I can say for a fact that even though it's an urban area, people have absolutely no awareness, even till date, of what women's health means, what a healthy menstrual cycle means, what is to be done when a woman is saying that she has menstrual and hormonal disorders. Are there any support systems for women, for new mothers or whatever? There is such less awareness. So when we say it's an urban problem or a rural problem, we are making the spatial contextualization of the issue very, very in a very, very reductive manner. This is a kind of contextualization that does not work in a country like India. Tier 2 cities. Look at the kind of cities which are labeled as tier 2. There are places like Bhilwara and Bhiwandi, which a lot of people will not even have heard about, and there are some other very well-known big cities in the country as well. So the gradient is so high, the gradient is so diverse that we cannot even for a moment tell ourselves that a certain demographic has got it figured out when it comes to issues, and a certain demographic has none. When it comes to gender and women's health, we have made very little systemic progress. Yes, women who are in the urban spaces, who have an education, who are financially independent, they have much more access. And access is a big problem in the rural areas and in the under-resourced communities among the urban slums and such demographics. Access is a problem that to a very great extent a financially independent woman has solved for herself. But what are the politics of access? Access is not something that, I need something and I'm going to go to the market and get it. For instance, a lot of people are these days talking about menstrual health products. And if you're a design student, this is a challenge that you should definitely take up. We are these days talking about period panties, menstrual cups, biodegradable sanitary napkins, which all research has shown that they are not completely biodegradable or compostable unless they are met certain conditions, certain disposal conditions. And obviously in daily life, it's not possible to do that. And of course, there are those sanitary napkins like the Whispers and the Stay Frees and the mainstream ones. Most of these products are based on such little research on what exactly is helpful for women's health. For instance, we are still using bleach, we are still using dioxins. So when it comes to products, when it comes to interventions, what is important is that we don't essentialize women's health as just associated with reproductive responsibility, that we will get to, we will understand women's health more when only when it comes to fertility health or only when it comes to hygiene. But we have to reframe women's health as an issue that is a public health issue. That is something that has to be solved systemically through a design thinking of language itself. We celebrated Menstrual Hygiene Day a couple of days ago, but what we need to do is celebrate Menstrual Health Day and use it as an entry point of interventions for women's health. And as design thinking students, I think it will be great if you think of entirely new products. If you think of how spaces can be conducive to women's health and well-being, which takes care of their health, and how we can redefine a culture of care around women so that they get the adequate access, they get the adequate health care, and they don't put themselves last. So these are some ideas I wanted to throw at you, and I'm very happy to speak with you offline, over WhatsApp, email, or whatever, and even beyond the scope of this event, if you're interested in this and explore synergies. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Swarnima. That was, I mean, I don't even have a word for it. Usually these conversations really well me up, but I think the rigor with which you spoke about it, I think needs action rather than becoming sensitive about it every time when it comes up. I think, I think the word I could use is the thoroughness of approaching this subject in 15 minutes or 18 minutes that you had, where you sort of took us around, all around it, made sure that different aspects of this, of the issues related to women health are highlighted. And I think one of the intentions we had to bring you on board was also because this is going to become more and more a concern when we imagine lockdown lives. At least one of the things I've been following up was on domestic violence, and I didn't have the heart to even follow it up beyond, I think, first week, because it was world over, it was not just India. And then you would imagine what must be happening in India, where things are also going unrecorded, right? And then when we see women as only a responsibility for reproduction, I think it just makes it worse when you imagine. So I really hope that at least we could discuss on the idea of culture for care, which you have brought it up over the next 1.5 days, and then the other design ideas and research ideas which perhaps need prolonged engagement. This video, which we'll put out, but also the participants will perhaps spread the word so that people might collaborate with you and your team, and more work happens in this area. Thank you so much. It's very inspiring, and I can only imagine it must be a very strugglesome track to follow. We wish you really all the best. I am going to stick to the format as we had discussed. We will end this session. What I am going to share with you all on WhatsApp is a Google document which is open now, and we'll keep it open until post-lunch. If you all can please share your questions, highlight the speaker for whom you want to basically address your question to, and keep it to bare minimum, let's say 2 or 3 questions, so that it helps us moderate the evening session. I know we had said it's supposed to be a public debate, but we are not very rigid about these formats. We would rather first allow for an interaction between speakers and participants. You can also take up conversation over personal chats as the speakers have suggested. And if your questions are resolved, we'll move on to a debate mode where everybody can talk to each other. But I do feel that the questions, if they are discussed again as a collective, we all will also be able to learn from it. So choice is completely yours. I'm just going to share the link with you all. Just make sure that you all are able to see it in WhatsApp, so we're all on the same page. So there's a Google Doc link which I just shared in DD12. The document is called DD12 Q&A following session 1. And you have the editorial rights, all of you. Yes, I can see 1 or 2 gooses and Manate who are online. That means it's working. So let's take a break. Let's mull over what we heard. I also would want to remind participants that this is now your time to start thinking about your responses, your ideas. So if you are already working on something, please bring it up in tomorrow's presentation. But if you want to collaborate with any of these speakers, if you have any responses in terms of social well-being and what needs to be done as a creative endeavor, please start thinking over it, start making your stories, your presentations, whichever way you want to bring it forward to us. As I had said in the message earlier on Facebook also, you can paint, perform, however you would like to represent your idea. And let's continue the discussion at 6 today. I'll send you the link as well over email in some time. All right, thank you guys. Ending this session and chat with you all 6 p.m. onwards. Bye.